Hey everybody. A lot of people have written articles and produced videos criticizing the American Psychological Association's new guidelines that attack traditional masculinity. While there's a few common reasons cited for this, I haven't seen a single article or video that actually debunks the pseudoscience and misandry behind the APA's new guidelines. So that's what this video is going to be about. Further, this deep dive will show that the basis of these guidelines are founded in feminist bigotry and junk science based on grievance studies. But before we get started, it's important to have some background on the state of grievance studies. If you remember, in mid-2018, there was a study that came out called Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at Urban Dog Parks. And we're just going to kind of highlight some portions of the article. Have you always harbored a secret desire to lurk at dog parks, tirelessly inspect the dog's genitals in order to record their sexes, observe how frequently they hump each other, and ask their owners personal questions? If so, you might enjoy a new study, Human Reactions to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. Yes, the paper is about dog-on-dog rape and what it means for feminism and queer theory. The study was recently published in Gender, Place, and Culture, a peer-reviewed journal, which leads us to our second article. Academic Grievance Studies and the Corruption of Scholarship. This was published in October of 2018. Let's touch on some of the highlights. Scholarship based less upon finding truth and more upon attending to social grievances has become firmly established, if not fully dominant, within these fields. And their scholars increasingly bully students, administrators, and other departments into adhering to their worldview. This worldview is not scientific, nor is it rigorous. We spent that time writing academic papers and publishing them in respected peer-reviewed journals associated with fields of scholarship loosely defined as cultural studies or identity studies, for example, gender studies, or critical theory, because it is rooted in that postmodern brand of theory which arose in the late 60s. As a result of this work, we have come to call these fields grievance studies in shorthand because of their common goal of problematizing aspects of culture in minute detail in order to attempt diagnosis of power imbalances and oppression rooted in identity. And then they go on to talk about the hoax papers they submitted to prove their point. And the first one that we discussed in the previous article was about human relations to rape culture and queer performativity in urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon. And this was submitted by Helen Wilson, PhD, of Portland Ungendering Research, otherwise known as PUR, which is, by the way, fictional. Not only was this article accepted and published, it was recognized for excellence. Again, it was a hoax. And then we move on to fat bodybuilding. Who are they to judge? Overcoming anthropometry and a framework for fat bodybuilding. Now, this was submitted by a real person who gave them permission to use his scholarly identity for this project. And again, this was not only peer-reviewed, it was published. Then we move on to an article about dildos called Going In Through the Back Door, Challenging Straight Male Homohysteria and Transphobia Through Receptive Penetrative Sex Toy Use. Again, submitted by a fictional person from the PUR Initiative. And again, this was peer-reviewed and it was published. Then we move on to Hooters, an ethnography of breastaurant masculinity, themes of objectification, sexual conquest, male control, and masculine toughness in a sexually objectifying restaurant. Again, peer-reviewed and published. And then we move on to Hoax or Hoaxes 2, or HOH2, When the Joke is on You, a feminist perspective of how positionality influences satire. And again, nobody got this, but peer-reviewed, accepted, and I think it was published. And then we move on to Moon Meetings. Moon Meetings and the Meaning of Sisterhood, a poetic portrayal of lived feminist spirituality. Again, from the PUR Initiative, again, accepted without any requested revisions or comments. Okay? I mean, oh my God. All right, we're moving on. Okay, the final one, Feminist Mein Kampf, or FMK. Our struggle is my struggle. Solidarity feminism in an intersectional reply to neoliberal and choice feminism. Again, from the PUR Initiative, and both authors were fictional. And again, this article was peer-reviewed and accepted. So all these articles were hoaxes. They just made them up. And they made them up to demonstrate exactly how corrupt grievance studies are. Now, let's move on to the next article. This article from Quillette is titled The Grievance Study Scandal, 5 Academics Respond. 20 years ago, Alan Sokol called postmodernism fashionable nonsense. Today, postmodernism isn't a fashion, it's our culture. A large proportion of students at elite universities are now inducted into this cult of hate, ignorance, and pseudo-philosophy. Postmodernism is the unquestioned dogma of the literary intellectual class and the art establishment. It has taken over most of the humanities and some of the social sciences, and is even making inroads in STEM fields. It threatens to melt all our intellectual traditions into the same oozing mush of political slogans and empty verbiage. Postmodernists pretend to be experts in what they call quote-unquote theory. They claim that, although their scholarship may seem incomprehensible, this is because they are like mathematicians or physicists. They express profound truths in a way that cannot be understood without training or indoctrination into bullshit. And then they go on to state, some of the most insidious dogmas many faculty in these fields defend include the idea that evolutionary biology can explain animal behavior, but isn't very relevant to people. That differences in personality and intelligence can only be explained by education and parenting, not genes. That IQ tests don't predict anything useful. That differences in outcomes for different groups can only be explained by oppression or systemic racism/sexism. And that in 5 decades of behavioral genetics research can be safely ignored when it threatens environmental explanations. These are the dangers of our time. It is worth reminding those who subsidize this circus that we're not in Las Vegas. Which brings us to the main subject of this video, and that is the American Psychological Association's new guidelines for men and boys. The APA issues first ever guidelines for practice with men and boys by Stephanie Pappas. Now, remember that name because it's going to be extremely relevant very soon. And some of the takeaways from this article include, men represent 77% of homicide victims. They're the demographic group most at risk of being victimized by violent crime. They are 3.5 times more likely than women to die by suicide, and their life expectancy is 4.9 years shorter than women's. Boys are far more likely to be diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder than girls. They face harsher punishments in school, especially boys of color. Now, what they also leave out is the fact that males also receive harsher punishments in prison sentences than women as well when they get convicted of crimes. Now, the key thrust and basis of these new guidelines is the following 3 studies. Let's kind of talk about them a little bit. The main thrust of the subsequent research is that traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, is, on the whole, harmful. Men socialized in this way are less likely to engage in healthy behaviors, unless, of course, you're, Marcus Aurelius or any of the other great men throughout history, but that's a subject for another video. For example, a 2011 study led by Kristen Springer, PhD of Rutgers University, found that men with the strongest beliefs about masculinity were only half as likely as men with more moderate masculine beliefs to get preventative health care. And in 2007, researchers led by James Malahik, PhD of Boston College, found that the more men conformed to masculine norms, the more likely they were to consider as normal risky behaviors such as heavy drinking, using tobacco, and avoiding vegetables, and to engage in these risky behaviors themselves. This masculine reluctance toward self-care extends to psychological help. Research led by Omar Yousaf, PhD, found that men who bought into traditional notions of masculinity were more negative about seeking mental health services than those with more flexible gender attitudes. However, before we delve into these studies, we need to scroll back up, okay? We need to look at this issue here about the author, Stephanie Pappas. Now, why is that important? We're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about that. The first thing I want to discuss is an article from The New Yorker from 2016. A feminist edit-a-thon seeks to reshape Wikipedia. Now, I did a bunch of research to try to find out who Stephanie Pappas was. I think I found her, but I'm not sure because there is no information about this author, Stephanie Pappas, from the APA anywhere. I did a search all throughout the United States, and I could not find a single therapist named Stephanie Pappas who is a practicing psychologist anywhere in the United States. And this is important because this article is a continuing education. If you look on the right-hand side of the article, it says About CE. CE Corner is a continuing education article offered by the APA's Office of CE and Psychology. To earn CE credit, After you read this article, complete an online learning exercise and take a CE test, all right? This is worth credit. This is actual educational curriculum for psychologists. I want you to remember that. It is continuing education, okay? Now, think about that, and then we're going to move back to this idea of feminists trying to reshape Wikipedia and why that's important. It's important because according to Life Science, Wikipedia's gender problem gets a closer look. And look, it's written by an author named Stephanie Pappas. Wikipedia has a gender problem. So this author, if it's the same person, is a card-carrying feminist. Let's move on. In addition to that, Life Science published another article by Stephanie Pappas called Gendered Grammar Linked to Global Sexism. And then finally, let's look at Stephanie Pappas' credentials. Again, I'm not sure if this is the same person, but this is the only person I could find with any kind of psychological professional credentialing at all. And according to Life Science, Stephanie has a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from the University of South Carolina and a graduate certificate in science communication from the University of California, Santa Cruz. So, if this is the same person, she has a Bachelor of Arts degree and no postgraduate psychological experience beyond a communication certificate. The reason this is important is because if this is the same person, Stephanie Pappas is not qualified to be presenting continuing educational material to graduate level psychologists. And more importantly, she's a feminist bigot. Now, not only is this a concern because she shouldn't be presenting this information at all, assuming, again, that it's the same person, but if it is the same person, this calls the credibility of the American Psychological Association into question. Because again, if this is the same person, then they have unqualified ideologues indoctrinating postgraduate professionals into propaganda masquerading as education. Now, with that said, let's talk about the pseudoscience behind these guidelines. We're going to scroll down a little bit, okay? Now, the first study that they discuss is from the Journal of Social Behavior. Now, I clicked on that link, and this is what I found. This is Macho Men and Preventative Healthcare Implications for Older Men in Different Social Classes. And again, if you look at it, it's from the Journal of Social Behavior. It's highlighted from 2011. Looks like number 52. We're going to go back over here. And again, it's volume 52, number 2. We go back to the Macho Man thing. Yeah, volume 2. And then it's got a parentheses for 2 in the citation. So I actually obtained this study. Here it is. Macho Men and Preventative Healthcare Implications for Older Men in Different Social Classes. Now we're going to highlight portions of this study. And the first portion that I think is relevant is it says that they used the Wisconsin longitudinal study. The authors conduct a population-based assessment of masculinity beliefs and preventative healthcare, including whether these relationships vary by SES. And SES is socioeconomic status. The results show that men with strong masculinity beliefs are half as likely as men with more moderate masculinity beliefs to receive preventative care. And then we're going to jump down to page 7 of the study. And this discusses their methodology. Data for the current project comes from the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study, a large longitudinal study of education, careers, health, and aging. The WLS began with 1/3 random sample of adolescent males and females who graduated from Wisconsin high schools in 1957, with subsequent waves of data collected in 1964, 1975, 1992, and 2004. Now, what they mean by that is that the students who graduated in 1957, they followed up on them in 64, 75, 92, and 2004. They didn't grab new Wisconsin high school graduates from 64, 75, 92, and 2004. They just followed the same group throughout their lives. So bear that in mind because that's going to be important. The WLS is a useful sample for this project because the respondents are chosen without regard to health status. The WLS continues extensive longitudinal information on SES and health, and the WS includes a hegemonic masculinity scale. Now, I actually did some research on this. It looks like, from what I found, the hegemonic masculinity index, or the measurement of hegemonic masculinity, was developed by feminists in Australia in the early 1980s, shortly after the Duluth model came out. Now, the masculinity scale was included in a 50% random sample of the 2004 surveys when the respondents were 65 years old. Now, this is important. In other words, 100% of those who took the survey were 65 years old. We restrict our analytic sample to men who have complete data on all items, resulting in approximately 1,000 men, depending on the specific outcome. So in other words, they excluded anybody who didn't complete every little aspect of the survey, and they excluded all women who took the survey. Okay? That's important. Now, the other piece that's important is they only used year 2000 data because it included the hegemonic masculinity scale test, which again is a feminist theory measurement originally created by Australian feminist scholars in the early 1980s. Now, it's also been criticized over the last few decades as well. And remember, the test was administered to 50% of the 65-year-old men and women in 2004, but they only used the men who completed the entire test. So in other words, they cherry-picked it. So basically, the concern here is that this is cherry-picked data. Let's move on. Now, here's the concern about this hegemonic masculinity test that they talk about. They admit the reliability of this test is only 0.61. However, to be considered reliable for testing in social sciences, according to everything else I researched, you need to have at least a reliability score of at least 0.70, which this study admits that it doesn't have. And on top of that, they actually compare it to a less reliable test to try to pretend it has some kind of credibility when it doesn't. And in addition to that, they try to make this seem as though they have control variables from prior years with that Wisconsin longitudinal study. But they admit that the hegemonic masculinity test wasn't even administered in those prior years. So they don't really have any kind of control group at all. They just have this cherry-picked data that they use to try to justify their outcomes. Now, because of this alone, the findings of this study appear to be questionable at best, because what do you expect from a grievance study other than cherry-picked data misrepresented through a feminist lens? Now, with that out of the way, let's see how the next study fares. Now, the next study was from 2007, okay, from some guy from Boston College, and it was published in Social Science and Medicine, Volume 64, number 11. And it's entitled Masculinity and Perceived Normative Health Behaviors as Predictors of Men's Health Behaviors. And again, Social Science and Medicine, June, Volume 11, number 64. So we go back again just to make sure that nobody's trying to say that I'm adjusting anything. If you look at the second to the last paragraph that's highlighted, you'll see again, Volume 64, number 11, Social Science and Medicine. We go back again one more time, Social Science Medicine, 64, Volume 11. Now, I have that study too. Let's take a look at it. Masculinity and Perceived Normative Health Behaviors as Predictors of Men's Health Behavior. Again, same author, Malahik. Now, again, we're only going to highlight this because we really don't have to do too much of a deep dive to really talk about the realities here. 140 men aged 18 to 78 were recruited from 27 unmoderated and moderated internet listservs of potential interest to men. They completed measures online assessing masculinity, their perceptions of normative health behaviors for men and women, and 8 health behaviors: alcohol abuse, seatbelt use, tobacco use, physical fighting, use of social support, exercise, dietary habits, and receipt of annual medical checkups. The findings suggest that masculinity and the perceived normativeness of other men's health behaviors significantly predicted participants' own health behaviors beyond that accounted for socio-demographic variables. In other words, education or income. Now again, this study wasn't a study. It was an online survey of 140 men whose average age was 42.9 years old. And these were mostly heterosexual white men, married or in relationships, university educated, and employed. Yet again, they claim that they controlled for socioeconomic variables. And they didn't, because there was no control group. They admit that in this study. Nor was there any credible representation of unemployed men, or men without college education, or men of color. Okay, this again is another example of extremely cherry-picked data. Let's move on to the third study and see how it fares. According to the APA, the third study was led by Omar Yousaf, PhD. It was published in Psychology of Men and Masculinity, Volume 16, number 2 from 2015. So I hunted that study down, And again, it's entitled An Investigation of Masculinity, Attitudes, Gender, and Attitudes Towards Psychological Help Seeking. Again, you can see it's Yosef O., published in 2015, Psychology of Men and Masculinity, 16, number 2. Which again, if you go back here, volume 16, number 2, 2015. Which this says right here, 2015, highlighted in blue. That study is entitled An Investigation of Masculinity, Attitudes, Gender, and Attitudes Towards Psychological Help Seeking. Previous research on attitudes towards psychological help seeking has shown that men are often reluctant to use psychological services. We investigated the relationships between subscription to traditional masculinity norms, gender, and help seeking attitudes using the Inventory of Attitudes Towards Seeking Mental Health Services, or the IASMHS, and the Male Role Norms Inventory, otherwise known as the MRNI-R, which measures the extent to which one believes that men should think and behave according to traditional male norms. Again, this sounds like feminist bullshit. I didn't actually look at this particular inventory, but it just sounds like some feminist BS construct. Maybe I'll do a video about it later. We're going to move on. In a sample of 124 participants, 51 females, 73 males, the men's IASMHS scores were lower, less favorable attitudes toward help seeking than women's, whereas men scored higher in the MRNI, more positive attitudes to traditional male norms. A regression analysis revealed that men's MRNI-R scores predicted their IASMHS scores. Older participants scored higher in the first test, and the effect of gender on the first test was limited when the second test scores were held constant. Our findings support the claim that men's masculinity ideals are a significant barrier to their psychological help seeking. Okay, let's find out if that's true. Let's go down to the methodology. Here's the method. 124 participants, 51 females and 73 males, took part in a study. Ages ranged from 18 to 65. Participants were recruited through email advertisements sent through university lists, student forums, public advertising, and online social networking websites. This broad recruitment strategy enabled recruitment of a demographically varied sample. However, most were from the London area. In terms of ethnicity, 64 participants identified themselves as British, 40 were Asian, 12 European, and 8 of other ethnicities. 78 were employed or self-employed, 45 were students, and 1 was retired or unemployed. What are the takeaways here? Well, nearly a third identified as Asian or 8 other ethnicities. Now, this was never verified. Everyone who involved themselves in these studies could have been women, but identified as men. Who knows? But let's focus on the Asians and other ethnicities for a second, which is a total of 48 people. In other words, just over a third of everybody involved in the study. Now, as we know from other news reporting, Asian is code for Muslim, though some could be traditionally Asian. Why is this important? Because of this study right here. Mental health help-seeking behaviors of Muslim immigrants in the United States overcoming social stigma and cultural mistrust. As in many cultures and religions, the stigma of mental illness and treatment in the Muslim immigrant community is deep-rooted. Compounded with the cultural mistrust of the Western mental health system, many in this community live with untreated mental health conditions that not only impact themselves, but impact their family and the larger community. And we're going to discuss one more study, and that one's going to be this one here. Cultural differences in professional help seeking, a comparison of Japan and the United States. Previous research has found cultural differences in the frequency of support seeking. Asians and Asian Americans report seeking support from their close others to deal with their stress less often compared to European Americans. So we realize very quickly that this third study, which claims masculine ideals limit psychological health seeking, could also just as easily be explained by cultural attitudes and stigmas toward mental health issues rather than gender issues alone. Had these pseudoscience idiots actually confirmed the identities of their participants and controlled for cultural attitudes toward mental health and associated social stigmas, then maybe the study might have been a bit more credible. But to me, it also appears to be garbage. So it's clear that the American Psychological Association's continuing education lacks credibility for 2 reasons. 1, it's possibly authored by a card-carrying, man-hating feminist hack. And secondly, the first 3 studies these new man-hating guidelines stand on are junk science grievance studies based on bigoted feminist ideology and propaganda, and they are not well-founded in science. These studies lack credibility because of the cherry-picked data, the lack of control groups, and the testing based on biased feminist ideology rather than objective science. Now, with that said, let's talk about the APA guidelines. According to these guidelines, men are the majority of homicide victims. They're more likely to be violent crime victims, and they're more likely to commit suicide. And their life expectancy is shorter. Now, since we know these guidelines are based on junk science, could there be any other reasons that these things are happening? Well, of course. It could be a lack of support from men. You see, a lot of people think that the hashtag #MeToo movement has been pushing this idea of a toxic masculinity narrative. But as you can see from these studies, healthy masculinity has been under attack by feminists for a long time. However, women receive all kinds of support. In fact, the United States government creates a website called womenshealth.gov. Okay? It's got a section here talking about health and wellness. There's a section talking about diseases and conditions that primarily affect women. They go into reproductive health. They even have all kinds of patient materials that you can download and look at to get the support you need. All kinds of information there from the United States government, womenshealth.gov. However, when you go to menshealth.gov, that site doesn't exist. Even worse, when you search for Office of Men's Health, which, by the way, if you look at the top of this page here, it is the Office on Women's Health, womenshealth.gov. You search for the Office on Men's Health, and this is what you get. This is the search results. Okay? You get Men's Health, womenshealth.gov. June is Men's Health Month. Okay? So men get a month, women get the rest of the year. They get their own website. Men can go fuck themselves. Then you have support the creation of an Office of Men's Health by Men's Health Magazine. And then you go down a little bit farther, and Salon.com has an article called, Should There Be an Office of Men's Health? I thought feminism was about equality. I thought it was about, women being equal to men. Okay? There is a womenshealth.gov, but men can go fuck themselves. But that probably has nothing to do with male life expectancy. The startling reality here is that in the United States and much of the Western world, men have no support at all. There is no option for men to get the help they need. So, of course, they die sooner. Of course, they don't get the mental health services they need. Of course, they don't get the preventative health they need, because systemic misandry exists all across the Western world. Thanks to feminism's gynocentric control over Western society, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States systemically discriminate against men, and now we can prove it. According to the Daily Mail, women are better off in more countries than men are, a new study has found. A method that assesses the forms of hardship and discrimination facing men and women has revealed males have it harder in 91 countries. The United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia all discriminate against men more than women, according to the study. Researchers say this is due to men receiving harsher punishments for the same crime, compulsory military service, and more occupational deaths than women. In fact, when it comes to occupational deaths, I believe I saw a number upwards of 95 to 97% of all occupational deaths are men. The top-ranked nation to favor women over men is claimed to be Saudi Arabia. I want you guys to think about that because that's going to be important here very soon. The index is based on 3 factors: educational opportunities, healthy life expectancy, and overall life satisfaction. A measure called the Global Gender Gap Index has been used as the yardstick for analyzing inequality since its inception in 2006. It became the most widely used measures of national gender inequality used by academics and policymakers across the world. Researchers have recently grown wary of the index and claim it does not measure issues where men are at a disadvantage. Professor Stowett also believes the complexity of the Global Gender Gap Index makes it difficult to distinguish whether gender differences are the result of social inequalities or personal preference, sort of like the wage gap, right? The simpler BIGI method, he says, is a much sounder alternative. No existing measure of gender inequality fully captures the hardships that are disproportionately experienced by men in many countries, and so they do not fully capture the extent to which any specific country is promoting the well-being of all its citizens. I want you to think about that for a moment, and the takeaways are pretty damning. Okay? Basically, what they're saying is that all feminist measures of gender inequality ignore men's issues. In other words, when there's problems with men, they don't even measure that. It's just not even on the scale. But the other thing that's just as surprising is that Saudi Arabia is the most gynocentric country in the world, which completely debunks feminist patriarchy theory entirely, since feminism is all but outlawed there. Yet again, according to the index, Saudi Arabia is more gynocentric, which, by the way, a lot of people in the manosphere have actually said. So this isn't something new to people in the MGTOW community, but it's definitely interesting. The fact that they're even talking about it at all is kind of amazing. More importantly, this study also debunks the feminist theory of oppression in the United States, which basically confirms the thesis of my book, The Feminist Lie. It was never about equality, because it was always about power and control at the expense of men. Thanks to gynocentric bigotry, men all across the Western world continue to be systemically discriminated against, especially in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Yet feminists pretend that it is women, not men, who are the oppressed. This feminist lie has been so widely adopted that it's now socially acceptable for the American Psychological Association to unethically stigmatize healthy masculinity as some sort of mental health disorder. In doing this, the mental health profession has jumped the shark and opened the door to allow feminists and other gender bigots to systemically target every heterosexual boy or man for mental health discrimination just for existing. Think about it. Little Johnny's playing football or baseball with his friends. He's seen by these bigots, and he's told that he needs to be institutionalized and drugged until he's stigmatized and indoctrinated enough to stop being masculine. And if his parents resist, then Child Protective Services, using these bigoted mental health guidelines, will kidnap little Johnny from his parents under color of law so the welfare state can emasculate him instead. This is the very definition of misandry. Now, let's provide another realistic hypothetical. One of the biggest complaints tradcons, PUAs, and other manosphere voices bring up is this idea that you got to put skin in the game. You got to man up. You got to maintain your frame. You got to be more alpha. You got to take charge. Well, these new APA guidelines are being implemented specifically to target exactly the type of alpha bro behavior that tradcons, PUA coaches, and dating coaches promote. I can see it now. Some alpha PUA tradcon bro mans up. The police show up and involuntarily commit our dating coach to either jail or a mental institution for the crime of manning up, now that traditional masculinity is stigmatized. What are the takeaways? Well, unless Western society reins in the gender bigotry that systemically discriminates against men and boys, Western society will collapse because it won't have the masculine men necessary to keep our culture's fabric together. I'm DDJ, and this has been your dose of misandry today.